at the risk of seeming ridiculous, and I almost feel that I have an emanation of feeling ridiculous from my skeptical neighbor, Peter Bailey. But if you ask me, what does Malcolm X mean to me? And if you can suppress your titters, I can say this much. Everywhere you look in the world at the moment, whether it might be Bosnia, or Haiti, or the former Soviet Union, or West Germany, now unified Federal Republic of Germany, you can see there are always basically two kinds of people. There are those who think that the tribe into which they were born is the main thing about themselves, and nothing can change that. And if they could only like themselves more for it, congratulate themselves more about it, they would be only too happy. And there are people who realize that internationalism is not just a desirable thing, it's actually the only way the world can be organized, and in practical terms is the only way it can be. And there are people who've had the experience of crossing that gulf. And Malcolm X, who had everything that white racism could throw at him, refused to let the racists be his teachers. And that is why his example, in the moral and exemplary sense, is undimmed. And that, I think, would be an excellent way in which to remember him as an example of a road along which a lot of people have still got a lot of travel.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. This is a special collaborative episode that we're doing with our good friend Ben Burgess. Before we bring Ben in, let's bring in the co-host today. We have part of the foreign policy cruise. Is going to be a jam-packed show, so let me hurry up with the introductions. First and foremost, let me introduce my homie, my dog, the man of the Mau Mau Hour, the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Soul clap.
What I forgot to say is the man most hated by
who?
Black bourgeoisie organizations.
Yes, one of which I'm a member.
I meant to say that. I left that out. It's Thursday. I'll make sure to find a way to shoehorn that in. Also joining us today is a man who really needs no introduction. He's somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. We cannot say where exactly he is. Every time you talk to him on the phone, you get a strange echo. You may know him as the PMC of the Death Star. We know him affectionately as Deep State Cuba.
Hello, everyone. I'm already on your phones.
I feel like looking at this screen, me and Ben Burgess are wearing the same shirt, and he actually ironed his. So now I'm even more mad that Ben Burgess one-upped me one more time with a goddamn iron shirt. Let's play the clip before we bring in our esteemed guest. Are you ready for today's show, Cuba? Were you a young Hitchens aficionado growing up?
By the time I came to Hitchens, he had already done his heel turn on the Iraq War.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to sort of discover his back catalog, the first album, right? Like the original series. And I kind of dug a lot of his work. And in fact, when I was in Vietnam, when I would introduce some cultural distinctions between Western and Asian culture, I'd assign a piece, his obituary of Ronald Reagan, where he refers to the former president as a senile lizard. And it scandalized my students. It's like, you can't talk that way about like a former leader. That's disrespectful. And I'm like, that's freedom of speech. Also, it's pretty good writing.
let me get this clip going, guys.
I would, however, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, and I almost feel that I have an emanation.
I lied. Pascal, can you entertain the people while I pull up the clip?
Yes, Jason is going to pull up the clip, and I'm going to basically give my story as to how I got exposed to Christopher Hitchens, since I am, a bit older than everyone else on the show. I remember Christopher Hitchens because when I was a kid, particularly growing up in the 70s and the 80s, as you guys are probably not surprised, I was a fan of political affairs television. So I used to watch the McLaughlin Group, Firing Line, This Week with David Brinkley. And at a young age, I was very much taken by Christopher Hitchens. And I was aware of, I wasn't cognizant of the full extent of his politics. I noticed that he was kind of more to the left of the normal mainstream political cadre at the time, and he was a normal fixture on those kind of shows. Of those of you who were old enough to remember, the McLaughlin Group was one of those kind of shows where on PBS you could watch. I think it came up either on the weekend or Friday. You would see McLaughlin, Pat Buchanan, sometimes Chris Matthews, Eleanor Cliff, and then every now and then, they might have Hitchens on, or you would see Hitchens definitely on Firing Line. I'm definitely old enough to remember Firing Line with William F. Buckley. And Shirley's like, yeah, McLaughlin Group came out on Fridays. That's correct. And you would see Hitchens and the one thing I really gotta say, for those of you who are too young to remember that time, even though there was a limited amount of media differentiation, meaning you only had 3 major networks and maybe 1 or 2 local channels and PBS, the quality of the discourse, I gotta tell you, was so much better than anything we see on contemporary news media. I mean, these people had a level of intellectual acumen and serious conversation. Of course, it was definitely within the range of, American capitalist realism in the 50-year counter-revolution, but it was a much higher caliber than we see today. So on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Jason, who's got the clip geared up, and we will check it out.
Nothing but Vietnam the last couple of weeks, and I have to tell you, it bothers me that there is this conventional wisdom that is in every article I hear, every article I read, every news report I hear about Vietnam was a wasted war. We should never have gone. I have said many times on the show, I thought it was a necessary war. We demonstrating to the bullies of the world that we would put ourselves on the line and spend lives. The Vietnam War didn't have to happen in Vietnam, but it had to happen somewhere. Well, I mean, the Russians...
No, I don't think so.
The Russians...
By 1968, Robert McNamara and Lyndon Johnson and all the people running the war had all said to their friends at the Senate and to their friends at the CIA and the FBI, this war is over, it's lost, we should never have got into it. But we can't break that news to the American people yet.
Right.
Now, how is that going to sound to people whose sons were lost in Vietnam after the war had been given up on by the political class?
Those are legitimate
questions. They are very legitimate
They
questions.
are, but Bill
It's
asked...
nice of you to say so, but that's I haven't got my trousers off yet. Excuse me.
Christopher Hitchens is to the Catholic Church and Mother Teresa what Michael Moore is to a ham sandwich. Relentless, unstoppable, and without fear. We love Hitchens.
Christopher Hitchens was once the darling of the political left. After dalliances with Trotskyism at Oxford University, he emerged as a titan of left-wing journalism, both in Great Britain and, later, in the United States. During the 1980s, he deployed his acerbic wit to critique the American empire to great effect. He also played the role of iconoclast, writing exposés on public figures ranging from Henry Kissinger to Mother Teresa. However, in the final years of his life, his politics seem to have metamorphized as he emerged as a supporter of the war on terrorism and George W. Bush's imperial misadventure in Iraq. What shaped Christopher Hitchens' political journey? How and why did he end up on the side of the neoconservative project? And how might we understand his legacy? We'll ask these questions and more. This is Revolution.
A liberal, like a socialist like myself, or any other kind of radical, can look back and say it's a jolly good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that time. We, had McGovern won, would have been spared, as well as Mrs. Kirkpatrick of the United Nations and various other bizarre phenomena in the Democratic Party. We'd have been spared the appalling corruption amounting practically to a coup against the Constitution in Washington. I think we would have been spared the particularly abysmal way that the Vietnam and Cambodia wars ended, and we would have been spared the 1974 near war between Greece and Turkey and the destruction and dismemberment of Cyprus.
I'm really mildly surprised that you think that Mr. Nixon's political appetite to control others ever reached the limits that L.B. Johnson, L.B. Days did. A position, by the way, which is reiterated by many friends of L.B. Days' political program.
Mr. Buckley, if I was to say to you that the government of Poland is a grand tyranny against its people, and you were to say, yes, but so is Czechoslovakia and so is Hungary, what is the point you're making?
Well, the point I'm making,
you mentioned many enemies, you mentioned
you...
other enemies of mine in an attempt to deflect from what must be surely an obvious point, which is that the Nixon victory in 1972, the beginning of what we're asked to hail and be pleased about as a liberal crack-up, was a disaster for the United States, for its democracy and for its institutions.
Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. All right. Are we ready to bring in our guest? He is the host of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. He's the author of now 3.5 books, because I know we co-authored a book, so that doesn't count as a whole authoring. He is the Ben Burgess.
Ben Burgess, welcome back.
Welcome.
Thank you for having.
Is that true? There's 3-ish, 4.5, 3.5.
Like call it 4 1/4. So I actually, so there are 2 books that are out. The Hitchens book is coming out, and I actually did write an academic book that like 10 nerds anywhere will read. But like we don't need to count that. We can call it 3 1/4.
I wasn't aware of the academic book.
This is a tenure committee, right?
Yeah, like I said, I think I probably personally know like at least half of the people who will read that book. So that's Well,
just because you said that on air, you're about to sell at least 4 more copies, unless it's one of those academic books that cost $200.
We sold out. We need another print run of 3.
That's right, exactly.
Burgess, these things are selling like hotcakes over here.
I like that accent.
So let's get, for those that don't know who Christopher Hitchens is, because earlier we were talking about a bit of a generational divide. Off air, even before you came on, we were having this conversation in our friendly chat that only TRI people are invited to. Pascal actually remembers Hitchens from his young years. I tried to actually put clips from the good Hitchens in there. There's too much to pull from the neocon turn because there's more recorded. And surprisingly, you can really only find him on C-SPAN.
Yeah, and he has these shows where he just like reads the newspaper and tells you it's bullshit. Right? American forces in Nicaragua. This will be a lie. Start to finish.
Well, I mean, Pascal mentioned Firing Line earlier, and I think in very different ways, C-SPAN and Firing Line, despite the ultra-conservative politics of William F. Buckley, are things that could have only existed on PBS, because any kind of commercial television where you actually had had to worry that, the audience is going to drop off at half an hour in or whatever. Like, you just could not have had long form conversations quite like that.
So who is Christopher Hitchens, and why is he important to the left at this moment right now?
Yeah, so Christopher Hitchens was a British journalist and essayist, literary critic, but mostly what he's remembered for are his writings about politics and religion. And as you, I think, alluded to in that opening video, he starts off his life politically as a Trotskyist, actually as a member of something called the International Socialists, which later became the Socialist Workers' Party in Great Britain. And he kind of kept that position more or less. I mean, he'd softened and moderated a little bit, even by like probably the late 70s. But he was still, very explicitly a socialist. Up until a book called Letters to a Young Contrarian that he put out in 2001. And I think this actually surprises a lot of people, especially a lot of younger people when they hear it, because a lot of people in sort of what's typically the audience for my stuff, who are younger socialists who maybe became radicalized after Bernie Sanders ran for president the first time in 2016, if they remember this guy at all, they remember him from cable news or YouTube, like if they saw it much later. And what they remember is the last 10 years of his life, 2001 through 2011, which I actually think, it's a very mixed bag, but is, even aside from the fact that I think he ended up with some foreign policy views that I would view as morally and politically catastrophic, I think is probably the least interesting decade of his life. But basically, he's remembered for two things in that decade. One, that he did take these really bad positions on what was been called the global war on terror. And the other is that he became much more strident about his atheism, or really anti-theism. And there are about 10,000 debates you can find on YouTube where he's arguing with priests or pastors or rabbis or, theologians about religion, which is certainly the second phase of what I remember him for. I mean, I was a weird kid, so when I was a teenager, I actually did read his column in the Nation magazine, and also the Alexander Coburn, who was sort of his frenemy at the Nation. But he sort of came onto my radar again with this stuff in the 2000s because I'm a deep philosophy nerd and I find stuff like that interesting. But I think that one of the goals that I had writing about him was to try to sort of bring to a new audience this body of work that he had for the first 30 years that he was writing. The first book that had Christopher Hitchens' name on the cover came out in 1971. It was actually a collection of essays by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels about the Paris Commune, with an introduction written by Christopher Hitchens. And again, 2001 is where he sort of finally gives up on socialism. We can talk about why that might be. But in between, I think he put out this body of work that's actually still really good, right? So, I mean, this is one of, this is the one that I think leftists are most likely to remember fondly, the trial of Henry Kissinger, which is just a brutally rigorous kind of prosecution statement about the crimes of Henry Kissinger in Southeast Asia and Latin America and elsewhere. But also, I would point people to, and I actually quote it pretty extensively in the book, this one, which is my personal favorite Hitchens book. It's called No One Left to Lie To, The Triangulations of William Jefferson Clinton, which is an absolutely savage and really, really well-written book about the Clinton administration from the left that gets into the sort of Dickensian horror show of so-called welfare reform, that gets into the cruise missile attacks on the Sudan, when which many people, including Hitchens, thought were partially motivated by trying to distract attention from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And one of the things I say in the book is that if Bernie Sanders had had more of a killer instinct, or maybe his campaign manager Jeff Weaver had,
so they would have handed out copies of that book.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the things I want to do in the book. The other thing I want to do in the book is try to explore the what went wrong question. Right?
Just finish the trilogy of.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Takedown.
So the missionary position, which is definitely the Hitchens book with the best title. It's about Mother Teresa.
Mother Teresa, which is. I did want to ask you a question and quote your book about the Clintons. I believe the quote you have here is from Hitchens. Where let me see, had the masses risen up against the insurance companies in response to the Clintons' populist appeal, they would have discovered that the four largest of them, Aetna, Prudential, MetLife, and Cigna, had helped finance and design the managed competition scheme which the Clintons and their Jackson Hole group had put forward in the first place. These corporations and the Clintons had also decided to exclude from consideration right from the start any single payer or Canadian style solution. A group of doctors at the Harvard Medical School, better known as Physicians for a National Health Program, devised a version of single payer which combined comprehensive coverage to include 40 million uninsured Americans with free choice in the selection of physicians. The Congressional Budget Office certified this plan as the most cost-effective on offer. Dr. David Himmelstein, one of the leaders of the group, met Mrs. Clinton in 1993. It became clear in the course of the conversation that she wanted two things simultaneously: the insurance giants on board and the option of attacking said giants if things went wrong. Dr. Himmelstein laid out the advantages of this plan and pointed out that some 70% of the public had shown support for such a scheme. "David," said the First Lady before wearily dismissing him, "tell me something interesting." When Hitchens was critiquing the Clintons, Bill was still known as the first black president.
Yes,
and was kind of a favorite in the eye of media. What was the political climate like that for Hitchens during this critique?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that I think this is a book, and not just the book, but I mean, I think his larger kind of war with the Clintons. That really alienated him from a lot of kind of liberal journalistic circles at the time. So I think it's almost hard to remember, looking back on it, just how bad the 90s were politically, like just how much worse in some ways they were politically than the era that we're in now. That somebody like Christopher Hitchens went on C-SPAN and said, "I'm a socialist," that was like, it was like a novelty act. Like, wait, what? Really? Right? You're a socialist? There are socialists still. And I think that even working for the nation, which is, I think has often occupied different eras of its history, kind of a gray zone between liberalism and leftism. But even there, I think a lot of people were very defensive about the Clintons, and he's really doing this in a very no quarter way. The stuff about the stuff about welfare reform is really bad in that book. I mean, what I like about that passage that Jason just read part of is that a little bit later after the part that he read, he talks about Hillary Care, this health insurance scheme that Hillary Clinton was pushing back then, and describes it as combining the worst of bureaucracy with the worst of the free market. And the way he's described it, it's like, man, that's just Obamacare, right? I mean, that was just the dry run.
Yeah, Obamacare is like, I'll take that challenge.
Yeah, no, exactly. Exactly.
Well, I wanted to jump in here,
because
I remember I was a full adult in the 90s. Not to say that you guys were toddlers, but I actually remember, and it's really interesting that we're talking about this period, right? Because I was in law school in the 90s, and I never voted for Bill Clinton. And one of the proudest things that I can say politically is that I never voted for Bill Clinton. I instinctively did not like him or trust him off the bat. He is my least favorite president of the post-civil rights era, and I've often said that Bill Clinton has done more damage to black people in America than any president going back to Woodrow Wilson. I despise the Clintons and their whole enterprise. And we're going to talk a lot about Hitchens' transition,
Mm-hmm.
but one of the saving graces that Hitchens has with me, because I really began to have a lot of contempt for him after the War on Terror for reasons we'll talk about later on. And one of the reasons that I have some level of still respect for him was that he literally, and it's going to be hard for people to understand this guy, in terms of mainstream media journalists, not academics, because there were some academics like Adolf Reed who were ringing the alarm about the Clintons too, but in terms of mainstream media journalists, this guy was pretty much on his own by himself in challenging the orthodoxy of Clintonism and third way neoliberal Democratic Party politics. And it's going to be hard for people today, in the age of post-2008 crash, in the age of post-Occupy, in the age of post-Bernie Sanders, to even understand this, right? Because one thing that I am old enough to understand and see is the complete fall from grace of Clintonism in the American social consciousness.
And it was completely hegemonic through the 90s.
Yeah.
It was farther than the 90s. Let me make this clear. When Facebook first began in 2007, this is in 2007, I used to get shouted down by people, particularly black folk, for saying Bill Clinton was a disaster as a president. I would get attacked, literally, by liberals, by black folk, all kinds of people. What are you talking about? Clinton was... It is hard for a lot of people to understand that there was an absolute consensus in the American body politic, really up until, I would say, Sanders and maybe Hillary's 2008 run, because she took a lot of the bloom off the rose as well. It is hard for people to understand that Bill Clinton was the embodiment of the American Democratic Party from the 90s.
Yes, the big dog.
Millennia.
And the thing is that throughout that entire period, he pushed all of these neoliberal reforms. He gutted welfare. He deregulated finance, which was catastrophic and set the stage for the continued roller coaster of financial crises and the utter domination economically of the United States by peak finance. But because of rising house prices, because of this late wave of job creation, job growth from the early American lead in the commercial internet and network technology, the check for all the damage he did wasn't payable until he was safely after office.
That's
out
correct.
Of office.
That's correct. And to the not to for us to digress too much, I've got to give ultimate respect on that front to Christopher Hitchens, because Christopher Hitchens,
he hates
despised the Clintons, viscerally hated them. And I remember, and I'm going to give Hitchens some props for this.
Oh.
And this, by the way, I'm not a fan of Hitchens overall, because I told you his trajectory post 2001, he was persona non grata to me. But I'm going to be fair. Bill Clinton was already in the White House. Christopher Hitchens was on C-SPAN, and it wasn't with Brian Lamb. It was one of their call-in shows, and he was asked, "What was the thing that really brought forth your contempt?" Because people thought he was nuts. People literally thought that he had like an obsessive compulsive, like OCD, like this crazed,
ex-girlfriend fixation
with the Clintons. And he was asked on C-SPAN, he was asked, "What is the thing that started this for you?" And when he said this story, I was like, wow, I gotta give this British white boy a little bit of respect. He said when he heard that Bill Clinton went to Arkansas while campaigning for president to sign off on the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, a black man who literally had the mental capacity of maybe a child or infant, purely in order to not be made to look soft on crime. He said, when I saw Bill Clinton do that, I realized this man was just the worst. When I saw Hitchens say that, I said, wow, Ricky Ray Rector is what it made you realize that this guy was the demon that he was.
Mm-hmm.
That's really when I said, you know what? Hitchens might not be all that bad.
Up until 2001, he had a very good sense for lizard people. Not just the Clintons, but Mother Teresa. That's also, right, that was not a popular position to take.
Which it was very much not. I mean, even today, Mother Teresa is remembered, by like 99% of people who know who she is.
She's a metaphor for saintliness.
Exactly. That like people will talk about people who are really self-sacrificed and noble, and they'll say, oh, she's, oh, you're not going to be like Mother Teresa, and the book, the Mother Teresa book actually starts out by talking to about Mother Teresa's connections to the Duvalier dictatorship and her general habit of sort of lending her aura of moral credibility to right-wing dictators, and it gets into some really gruesome stuff about the way that people would donate all this money to Sisters of Mercy because they thought that it was going to be spent on the care for the dying, and most of it was not. It was spent on missionary work. Because if anything, her view was that suffering like ennobles people, and so they really weren't using proper anesthetics. For example, in the House for the Dying in Calcutta, and it's actually kind of surprising in light of what Pascal's bringing up, his later trajectory, because the Mother Teresa book was written in the 90s, and given who Hitchens was in the 2000s, you would really expect that the sort of focus would be anti-religious. That's in fact the way, like that Penn and Teller clip that was part of what Jason played at the beginning. I mean, presumably that's how they were remembering it. They were kind of assimilating it to God is not great era Hitchens. But if you actually read the book, that's a surprisingly small element of it. It's not really even anti-Catholic, much less anti-religious. If anything, a lot of the emphasis is on the fact that Mother Teresa is aligned with this kind of right-wing fundamentalist, faction within the Catholic Church that was fending off challenges from more progressive Catholic, Catholic groups. I mean, the only sort of hint in that book of the kind of thing that he would focus more on later is when he kind of takes a couple of pages to debunk this alleged miracle that was promoted by the British press, where I guess Irish press in this case, but where there was like footage from inside the House of the Dying in Calcutta that supposedly the light shouldn't have been good enough, but they could, but not only it turned out really well, and the Malcolm Muggeridge, who was the journalist, reported this, said it looked like the scene was bathed in eerie divine light, and there's a kind of funny couple pages where he explains why that's not actually what happened. But other than that, that's not really the focus. He doesn't really care that much about Mother Teresa's metaphysical beliefs in that book. He really cares about the fact that she was allying herself with death squad dictators.
Yeah, in fact, it's a much harder criticism to make. It's not, oh, she's a religious fanatic, because, it comes with the territory. But his accusation was that she's a fraud and a villain, and then he made it stick. His criticisms, generally speaking, were unanswerable, especially when he dedicated the whole book to it. After reading the trial, any one of that powerhouse trilogy, right? You cannot look at the figure innocently again.
Yeah, funny side, by the way, my Croatian grandfather, when after being told about the original Vanity Fair piece where Hitchens described Mother Teresa as a thieving Albanian dwarf, his only comment on that was, I thought she was Croatian.
Wow.
But
if she's Albanian, he can say whatever he wants.
yeah, exactly.
Do you think all these books that he wrote about these people that were so extremely powerful and influential? I mean, Kissinger, shit, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't he on the board at Theranos?
Kissinger. Well, I mean, we can even look at a couple weeks ago. There was that scandal not very many weeks ago at Yale about you guys know about this, where they have something called the Grand Strategy Program at Yale, which you combine the Ivy League setting with the title Grand Strategy Program, and I kind of get visions of people in black robes. But in any case,
the robes are off black.
But the professor who ran it ended up kind of being pushed out of her position because of pressure from donors, because the donors wanted this advisory panel for the program and one of the names they were insisting on for the advisory panel was Henry Kissinger.
Oh my God.
The Henry Kissinger, I think he's he might be, I can't remember if it was him or a figure from the Bush administration, but sometimes it catches up to you. There's one neocon war criminal that can't travel because they're under indictment from the ICC.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true about Henry Kissinger, that there are, like, even in, even by the time, like, I think 2002 or something is the preface to the second edition of the Kissinger book, he talks about some of this stuff, that there are multiple countries that in which Henry Kissinger was at least wanted for questioning due to things like involvement in trying to have citizens of that country assassinated in Chile. For example, I think Spain might have been one of those countries. I mean, they were the ones who actually ultimately extradited Pinochet. So yeah, even by like 2002, like the number of countries in the world that Kissinger could travel to was very limited. Had been limited by that. Although in America, you'd hardly notice the difference. He's still, like, after after American troops finally withdrew from Afghanistan this year, Henry Kissinger wrote an essay about it for I don't actually remember the journal, but it's like some fairly prestigious magazine. Henry.
At this point, for most people, he's like an American Yoda. He's like super old. He talks funny, but he's wise, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there's, I mean, actually, the most in the sort of parade of horrors in the Kissinger book, talking about Kissinger's involvement in actually even an earlier attempt to overthrow Salvador Allende. Talk about his really disgusting role in Cyprus, talk about the war crimes in Vietnam and Cambodia. But one of the most striking passages in there is one where I think it's in the introduction. He just says, like, could this like sort of awkward little man at like the like Washington D.C. cocktail party, could he really be the one who was conspiring to assassinate left-wing presidents and kidnap journalists and et cetera, et cetera? Yeah, no, that's it. That's the same man.
He's like the American Berea.
Yeah, right. Yes,
but the Kissinger takedown was definitely priceless as well. And it's amazing to me that we've gone so far into the program and we haven't really talked about, you know,
What happened?
what
later.
happened to him. And
Right.
I gotta tell you something. As I'm enjoying this conversation so much, I kind of don't even want to go there because
Well, I kind of wanted to go back. I did have a follow-up question that originally I had wanted
Yeah.
to ask about, what is it about Hitchens that he can kind of see the demagoguery in these Democratic Party candidates or mainstays like the Clintons? What is it about him that can see that? And he's critiquing it at a time when you just don't critique it, because we have to keep this in the context of the moment. The 90s is a time period where the left is dead.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
completely dead, which actually I think is going to be very relevant to the question that we
I
haven't
think I have
really
an
addressed
answer for
yet
that.
about. Yeah,
I think it was the fact that he was a Marxist. Because frankly, if you actually talk to Marxists or read the writings of Marxists from that period, they were very much like, no, this Clinton shit is like not, because this is the thing. Marxists or people or materialists on the left have the understanding that the liberals are betrayers, that the liberals can't be trusted.
which is a very funny thing.
A socialist because he doesn't want to be called a liberal.
Yeah,
Also-
I mean, there is a really funny clip. I remember Michael Brooks played on TMBS where it's Hitchens on C-SPAN, and the caller is like denouncing him, for being a spineless liberal, and from a sort of Reaganite perspective, and it's like, Madame, you do not know how much you have insulted me, calling me a liberal,
Liberal.
yeah, and I think that because he did come from that other tradition, he wasn't bound up, he didn't emotionally live and die with the fate of the American Democratic Party because he was a transplanted British socialist. And even in the 90s, when I think that started to fray a little bit, because of what we've kind of alluded to a few times, which is just how dead the left was in the 90s, that the idea that there was really anything to the left of just regular Democratic Party liberalism was just off the map. I mean, that was in the, Here They Be Dragons, that like that's just not even part of the cartography. And even within, the Democratic Party, I mean, look, right now, we're all very pissed, very correctly, at the Democrats because they promised that they would do some moderately good things, and now they're screwing it up. They're not going to do it, right? That's we heard we were going to get free community college. There was talk of the PRO Act, and there's been this series of predictable disappointments. I will say, if you read my stuff in Jacobin from before Joe Biden took office, I did sort of say all this would happen because we've seen this movie before under Obama, but everybody's very pissed off because of these broken promises, as well they should be. But that's nothing compared to the stuff that was going on in the 90s that liberals were defensive of. That over the course of his 8 years in office, Bill Clinton signed NAFTA.
Crime bill.
GATT. Yeah, he had he actually campaigned in 1992, right? That same election where he's overseeing the execution of Billy Ray Rector. He campaigned on the promise to end welfare as we know it, and
predators.
He fulfilled it in a brutal way. He would fearmonger about about crime, super predators. He in general there was this huge like he was really aggressively sort of finishing that kind of counter revolution that really got going with Carter and Reagan. He was aggressively pushing that forward throughout the 90s, and things were so bad politically. There was so little opposition that nobody, like regular liberals, left liberals, people who are in that sort of that sort of indeterminate zone between leftism and liberalism, tended to, be very defensive of the Clinton administration because, what they saw, the sort of political reality they cared about was every day the Clinton administration was being attacked, from the right, by Newt Gingrich or whoever, Rush Limbaugh. And so they had this protective instinct because of that, but there was no, like, when welfare reform happened, which was really like gruesome in the way that was carried out. There were no, like, nobody was, there were no mass protests about that. Not really.
No.
There was very little, like, okay, maybe at a college campus, you'd say a Noam Chomsky lecture or something, he'd say something about it, but like, there was nothing like that. The idea, like what happened in 2016, that, Bernie Sanders is an imperfect figure and we can criticize his flaws, we should, but that Bernie Sanders could run for president and win 22 states calling himself a socialist. It's hard to express how unimaginable that would have been in the 90s. I mean, even in 2008, Pascal referred to that election earlier, like what passed for a left populist candidate in 2008 was John Edwards, who was basically
I supported Edwards, believe it or not.
Yeah, right. Because he was, out of those three,
he wasn't a Clinton.
He was the only.
No, he was talking about poor people. Edwards,
he was the only one who was talking about poor people in 2008.
He ran a campaign basically challenging poverty, saying poverty is a problem.
Yeah,
and that is something that is, outside the pale for even most of American mainstream politics. You don't really hear people talking about poor people very much,
because the market has decided. If the market has decided that you need to be poor, then that's just how it is. But
it is worth noting that even John Edwards, who is the only one of these candidates who would actually talk about poverty as a problem and mention economic inequality, John Edwards wasn't advocating Medicare for all, right? No. Or anything like it. I mean, like, what he was advocating was much more like Obamacare, and the fact that he was the one who was like the closest to a Bernie Sanders kind of figure in 2008 really tells you how dismal it was. I mean, the person who had like the Bernie kind of policy proposals in 2004 and 2008 was Dennis Kucinich, who was largely like a comic relief figure, because this was so far outside of the bounds of mainstream American discourse up until, again, 2008 crash, Occupy Wall Street, Bernie, like there was this series of things that changed the political landscape for the better. But in the 90s, this is the era of, Margaret Thatcher saying, famously, there is no alternative. And actually also, I think
Francis Fukuyama, the end of history.
Yeah, no, exactly.
There's the 800-pound, listen, Ben may not like me going here, but I want to go there, is that one of the things that helped energize this kind of like, there is no options. It's like, this is basically the era of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
No, I think that's totally right. I think that because I think that as bad as the Soviet Union was in many ways, at least as long as it existed, it kept alive the idea that there was some sort of large-scale conflict between different visions for how to organize society. And when that was gone, that sense that was even a question, right? How an economic system should be organized was just completely dropped off of like the sort of consensus vision of what politics was about. And I think, maybe to finally get us to this question, I think that's actually a lot of what explains what happened to Hitchens, because there are a lot of different explanations that are sort of thrown around on the left, because I mean, again, I think I'm on This Is Revolution. I don't think we need to recite why his positions on Iraq and Afghanistan and all that were so indefensible. I think we could just take that as a given. But once you accept that and ask the more interesting question, which is, okay, what happened? Then the explanations that are thrown around range from Islamophobia, which, I'm not going to deny could be an element, although I also think that it's more complicated than that, especially if you look at the fact that throughout this entire period, he was very involved with and sort of aligned with the Kurdish leadership in Iraq. He'd wear the flag pin of the flag of Kurdistan. And I think the connection between those two things is a little tricky anyway, because people will say, well, it's the anti-theism leading to Islamophobia leading to this, but then you say, okay, I can understand how anti-theism leading to Islamophobia could result in supporting the war in Afghanistan. It's a little harder to see how it ends up supporting the war in Iraq, considering that Saddam Hussein was a secular tyrant and who'd actually done a very good job of suppressing local Islamists. And in fact, many people who shared Christopher Hitchens' views on religion instinctively distrusted a war to destabilize the Middle East as part of a world remaking scheme by a president who wore his evangelical Christianity on his sleeve. So I don't think that's it.
I think that there's another part of the 90s zeitgeist which we're missing. And with the end of the ideological polarization between the USSR and the US, and with the opening of this kind of narrative of the end of history, opportunity for everyone, the internet, Dow 36,000, there was no excuse not to succeed anymore. And there was a tremendous charisma around the millionaire, around the famous person, around the successful individual, which gave their analysis, their opinions, the ring of gospel. And if you disagreed with them, especially if you disagreed with them while identifying as a socialist, which, you know, like fewer of them than leprechauns, then it was.
Are you talking about people like Thomas Friedman?
He's, is he a leprechaun? No, Thomas Friedman. You're
more
absolutely
trollish.
Right. Exactly. He's
but are you talking about, like, you know, these kind of famous people that are pundits?
Yeah. So just to.
I'm sorry.
He's considered to be a great intellectual, Thomas Friedman, which is only possible.
Which I was just going to say. And actually, I think the Thomas Friedman example is a really interesting one, because even when Hitchens had these really bad, really indefensible positions in Iraq and Afghanistan, he did maintain all these weird sort of remnants of his leftist worldview. Like he would even go to bat. You could find him on C-SPAN in like 2002 arguing with Andrew Sullivan about Palestine and taking good positions on Palestine, saying that you can't class, you know, Palestinian so-called terrorism together with Al Qaeda because these people have legitimate complaint, you know, that how much of this are they supposed to take, and so I don't really buy the anti-theism leading to Islamophobia explanation. Like some people will just sort of say, well, you know, it's just opportunism. I don't really buy that. You know, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, the man loved the camera, but I don't think that explains it, especially because he was very willing to take extremely unpopular positions. Some people say it's the drinking. I would say there have been a lot of robustly socialist drunks in history. I don't think that's it. I think that really what you have to look at to understand what happened here are two things. I'll just try to do this really quickly. One, that he did spend so much of his life as a sort of globetrotting journalist going to places like Iraq, where he would meet, you know, local dissidents. You know, he was concerned about the conditions people in these countries. You know, his friends in places like Iraqi Kurdistan, and presumably in the 70s and 80s and even into some of the 90s, he held out some faith that like a renewed wave of international socialism would be what would ultimately bring down these terrible regimes in these places. But I think over the course of the 90s, he gave up on that, because even though, you know, he was originally a Trotskyist back in, you know, the Vietnam era, and I know some people want to say, well, Trotskyism is like a gateway drug to, you know, to just sort of going back into
neoconservatism.
Yeah, which I don't really buy. I talk about this a little bit in the book. I think the actual number of people that we're talking about who trod that particular path is a lot fewer than people sometimes portray it as. You also have people who are like Stalinists or Maoists, you know, who became, you know, conservatives or even neoconservatives, you know, people like Bernard-Henri Lévy. You know, so I don't think it's the Trotskyism. I think that it's the end of history. So I think it's the end of history combined with the fact that he had spent all this time as a globetrotting journalist, getting to know people in these countries, and he really did care about, you know, socialism was off the table, which I think it increasingly became for him over the course of the 90s. I think even though he was a Trotskyist, I think that what Pascal, you know, I mean, whatever, he hadn't been a Trotskyist for a long time, but even though he originally came out of that tradition, even if he had moderated a lot, you know, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I think what Pascal is talking about, that without the Soviet Union, this is harder to have a sense that, how to organize a society is really a question up for debate anymore. And so I think in that pervasive, there is no alternative end of history atmosphere, I think he gradually gave up on taking socialism seriously as a real historical possibility.
But
And also, he became friends with, he went to the Washington, D.C. Dinner parties. His interlocutors were also part of his social world, and they were influencing him at a point when it seemed like his political pole star
position was dead. But why does Christopher Hitchens, who always had a bigger platform, and I think the accent had a lot to do with it, because he wasn't
for sure
the most educated out of all these people during this time frame, right? Let's just be honest. And he kind of finagled a character for himself, especially as he got older. I think the drinking did play into it a little bit. I in reading the book, I would push back against that and say he reminded me more of Bukowski as he gets older and he's drinking with the cigarette, like I'm hip Chomsky.
I mean,
for the left,
Bukowski's a little bit more
make
of
the same turn. Parenti is also pretty radical at the same time, never having the platform of Hitchens or Chomsky. Why don't the smaller guys in this scene, the Michael Alberts, the Parentis, the Chomskys, who else can we throw into this category of old school socialists in the 80s and 90s? Pascal, you got anybody you can name off the top of your head? I think Cornel West gets more radical as he gets older.
Cornel West was actually making excuses for neoliberals in the 90s.
That's what I'm saying. As he gets older, as Cornel West gets older.
I don't think Gore Vidal never really struck me as a fan of the Clintons by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, Gore Vidal, I mean, I think 9/11 sort of broke both Hitchens and Gore Vidal, but in opposite directions. That Gore Vidal kind of became a lunatic conspiracy theorist, and whereas Hitchens, of course, had the opposite problem and reacted to 9/11. He kind of interpreted it as what it sort of needed to be for him at that time, which was a way of saying, look, there's this, war against, Islamofascism that like justifies, the cause of sort of spreading liberal secular democracy. But I would say, and look, obviously there's no one thing that's an explanation, and I think everything you're pointing to is probably part of it. I would say probably, Bukowski is a little bit more of a vomit in the alley and write a poem about it drunk, which is a different kind of vibe from the like, have a martini and argue about Jane Austen drunk, which is more where Hitchens was. But yeah, look, I think that you can say, why do one person zig while another person zags? It could be a very complex combination of factors. But I think one big thing is that in that post-Cold War world, with no real hope left for socialism, but with these connections in Kurdistan, these connections in Bosnia, which he went to in the 90s. We haven't talked about it at all, but I think it's a huge part of the story because that was the sort of place where he really started to soften up to the idea that the American empire could actually be a force for good in the world.
And that's the one place where it kind of worked.
Right. So just to real quick complete the thought. I mean, I think that you put these two things together, think, well, if socialism's not on the table, then he at least wanted to convince himself that democratic revolution at least was on the table, and that's fine. Democratic revolution is all to the good, but then the really tragic, ridiculous mistake that I think is talking himself into something that just doesn't make sense is thinking that the U.S. military could be a force to spread democratic revolution, which I think the full absurdity of that, I think we got a really good view of when, this year, right? Because like the nanosecond the United States leaves Afghanistan, this government we've spent 20 years propping up falls with it, because of course, no attempt to remake a society is going to have that kind of credibility if it's being propped up by the 82nd Airborne. It has to come from within.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm not going to give Hitchens that much of a pass. I think his Islamophobia and atheism had a lot to do with it, because if that was the case, why did he spend a decade going on such a crusade against Islam and religion overall, if that wasn't a major part of the actual impetus that pushes him to support the Iraq War. I mean, he literally.
I also think that's what people wanted to hear at a certain point. If the way you're paying your bills is by your TV appearances, and that's the way you're selling your articles and making your money, at a certain point, you just play the song. And I think he definitely played the atheism song. I mean, we can go more into that in the next hour.
I also enjoyed it.
Well,
He's
sure,
clearly
yes,
having fun
I
with
think he
it today.
definitely enjoyed it. I mean, I talked to his brother Peter, and he did tell me something which fit with everything I knew that I think is important, as one thing that complicates the story about the new atheism leading to Islamophobia, you know, becoming it. Like, besides what I mentioned earlier, which is that an awful lot of people who shared all of his attitudes about religion had exactly the opposite reaction to the war in Iraq. And it wasn't despite that. In fact, to a great extent, it was because of that. They saw this sort of guy, George W. Bush, who was extremely Jesus-y, you know, who said at one point that God instructed him to strike against Iraq, you know, and having this sort of attempt to remake the world in America's image. And they had an instinctive revulsion to that I think actually went along very well. But the other thing I'd say, what Peter said, is that he thinks the anti-theism was probably the most consistent view that Hitchens had over the course of his life. You know, it was probably since, you know, he was 11, he said. And I don't know about that, you know, he would know better than I would, but I will say that you can find articles that he wrote in 1982 that, you know, that are anthologized in that collection, Prepared for the Worst, where he says a lot of the kinds of things about religion that he would say in the 2000s. Now, and I would not deny that his reaction to the 9/11 and his horrible positions, the war on terror, definitely gave a different flavor to the crusade against religion. And I think it's probably part of why he put so much emphasis on that. It's definitely part of why he put so much emphasis on that at that point.
It also comes up in the debates about European immigration and Islam in the West.
Yeah, but you can also watch, you know, like Hitchens, you know, 1986 debate with a couple of Ayn Randites, and in the course of there, you know, he's saying very militant atheist things. You know, that the somebody in the audience asks him, you know, basically if, you know, Jesus was a socialist, and he's like, don't pin that Jesus stuff on us, right? We don't want it. So I don't disagree that these things were all sort of connected in his worldview after 2001. I'm skeptical about how much it can explain about the change.
Well, on that note, we are over an hour. I thought we were going to cut it right at an hour, but there's just too many people with too much to say on the screen right now. I did talk to phone operator Mean Jean Bajlan. Ben, would you be down to take some phone calls tonight?
Yeah, I can. I do. You know, I do need to get back to you know, my wife and our friends in a little bit later in the evening, but you know, I can take a few phone calls. That sounds fun.
It should be. Yeah, we're also cross streaming this on your Patreon as well, so there shouldn't be.
Yes. And I should say, if you're a GTA patron, you should also have that email by now. If not, just go to the Patreon.
It's already.
And if you hate Ben and want to embarrass him with a stinging question, now's the time to join.
That's right. I'm sitting in the dunk tank, you know, with the there you go.
Now is the time. If you want to,
8 subscriptions are the best.
Pascal, are you ready for phone calls?
Sure, man.
Pascal doesn't like phone calls.
Hey, anybody got any vibes on the Virginia race?
No, but Eric Adams won as mayor.
That doesn't surprise me.
Well, sure.
He's the second black mayor in New York.
I remember the first one. Meh.
According to the rule book, I think me and Pascal are supposed to be excited about this.
Former cop backed by the real estate lobby.
What's not to love?
I mean, it's black power in action. And on that note, we will see you guys in the after hours.